recovered from the archived records of the Veylith Institute. Its existence has never been acknowledged by any public institution, and no government agency has claimed responsibility for its contents. Whether these events occurred exactly as described remains impossible to verify. What follows is presented exactly as it appears in the recovered archive. Case File 008. Classification: Meridian. Date of initial observation: August 2026. Location: Meridian Geochronology Laboratory. The Meridian investigation had been opened under Project Echo, an institute-wide program established after anomalous events began appearing across unrelated locations around the world. Individual departments continued to process their own observations, while selected measurements were transferred to Echo for cross-case analysis under the direction of Dr. Adrian Mercer. Project Meridian had been processing a routine series of Himalayan core samples for a long-term climate study when one section produced two different radiometric ages from the same isotope pair, with the difference large enough to place the material in entirely separate geological periods. The sample had been extracted from a sedimentary formation in the eastern Himalayas and appeared completely ordinary when Dr. Lena Sayegh began the first measurement. Yet the instrument returned an age of approximately 2.1 billion years, while a second measurement, taken from the same section, produced a result several 100 million years younger. Sayegh was still examining the readings when the displayed age began to change. The number moved gradually across the screen, passing through millions of years before settling close to the original value. And 17 minutes later, the same transition occurred again, moving toward the younger result, before returning toward the older one after another 17 minutes. By the fourth occurrence, Meridian had stopped treating the age as a fixed measurement and was recording the movement itself. Because the sample was changing between two apparent radioactive histories with a precision that allowed the interval to be measured. It was 17 minutes. The pattern continued through the night, with the sample moving between the two apparent ages at almost exactly the same interval, until shortly after 9 the following morning, when the isotope ratio produced a third reading that lasted for only a few seconds before disappearing. Sayegh watched the calculation complete and found that the new value represented a decay state the sample should not yet have reached. She kept the instruments running. 17 minutes later, the third reading appeared again, remaining on the display long enough for the system to capture the entire sequence before the sample returned to its earlier state. There was no visible change in the core itself, yet its measurements suggested that the material was somehow carrying evidence of different points in its own history, including one that belonged to a time that had not yet occurred. Meridian's complete dataset was forwarded to the Institute's Scientific Review Network that afternoon, where an archival comparison produced a result that Sayegh had no reason to expect. The system had found a similar periodic resonance in a field record from April 1998, recorded during an Institute expedition in the eastern Himalayas. The investigator listed on the report was Adrian Mercer. His instruments had recorded an unexplained resonance near the valley at 17-minute intervals. And beside the readings, Mercer had written a brief explanation that appeared to settle the matter at the time. Possible sensor drift. The record had remained untouched for 28 years. Mercer had never connected the resonance to the valley, and nobody had given the measurements a second interpretation. When Adrian Mercer saw the Meridian readings, he recognized the 17-minute interval before he understood what the measurements meant, because the same rhythm had appeared in his field records during the April 1998 expedition and had remained buried in his notes for almost 3 decades. The expedition had taken Mercer into an isolated section of the eastern Himalayas, where he was investigating a series of unusual geological readings when his instruments began registering a low periodic resonance from somewhere beyond the surveyed area. The resonance appeared at 17-minute intervals, and after several hours of following its direction, Mercer entered a narrow section of the valley where his field recorder suddenly lost several minutes of data without any interruption in its power or operation. When the recording resumed, Mercer was standing several meters from a stone structure that he had not been able to see from that position earlier in the expedition. He returned to the same area later that day, carrying the camera he had used during the first survey, and found a black, rectangular briefcase resting against the base of the structure. The space had been empty when he passed it earlier. Mercer checked the photographs from the first survey and found no trace of the briefcase, while the surrounding ground showed no tracks, disturbed vegetation, or other indication that someone had entered the area between his two visits. He took the briefcase with him and continued the expedition without attempting to determine how it had arrived there. Inside were manuscripts written in a language he did not recognize. The discovery remained outside the official report, and after the November 1998 investigation that became Case File 001, Mercer eventually retired from active institute service while continuing to study the manuscripts privately. Over the following years, he filled notebooks with partial translations, copied unfamiliar symbols by hand, and compared the material with the measurements recorded during his expedition, gradually finding references to recurring disturbances, an unknown city beneath 3 moons, and decades that appeared to have occurred long before the manuscripts reached him. The work produced few conclusions he was willing to trust, but Mercer continued because several passages suggested that the events described in the manuscripts were part of a repeating pattern rather than an isolated incident. In September 2022, the Institute contacted him about several children who had begun describing and reconstructing the same city, and Mercer joined the investigation as an external consultant while continuing his own research into the manuscripts. As the children's descriptions accumulated, details began appearing that corresponded with passages he had already translated, including features of the city that had never been part of any known Earth survey. For Mercer, the cases changed the direction of his research. The manuscripts were no longer simply records of something that had happened before. They appeared to contain evidence of something that could happen again. He continued studying them after Case File 003, concentrating on references to recurring events and the intervals between them, and when the beacon returned in November 2025, the pattern he had been tracing for years finally appeared to have entered another cycle. By 2026, Mercer had deciphered enough of the manuscripts to believe that the current cycle could become more dangerous than the previous one, and that was why he formally returned to the Institute in Case File 002, bringing years of private research with him. He still could not reconstruct the entire sequence, although the manuscripts appeared to describe several stages leading toward the destruction of the city, and some of those stages seemed to occur long before the final event. The Meridian sample had now provided another piece. Mercer placed his 1998 field records beside the laboratory data and studied the 2 sets of measurements, where the same 17-minute interval appeared despite the records being separated by 28 years and produced under completely different circumstances. That evening, he returned to the briefcase and opened the manuscripts again. One passage he had translated years earlier described objects whose measured ages appeared to change, although the researchers who recorded the phenomenon had treated it as an unusual property of matter rather than a warning of what was to come. Mercer read the passage again while the Meridian readings remained open beside it. For the first time, the description had a place in his own records. The resonance he had recorded near the valley in 1998 could no longer be dismissed as sensor drift. Whatever had produced it had returned.
Mercer spent most of the following night going through the manuscripts again,
returning to passages he had translated years earlier and comparing them with the Meridian data that remained open beside his notes, until one section drew his attention because its description of matter was remarkably close to what the laboratory was now recording. The passage described a period when objects around the city had begun producing conflicting measurements of their own age, with some materials appearing considerably older than the structure surrounding them, while others showed changes that belonged to a later stage of their existence. Mercer had translated one phrase several years earlier as, "those which forgot their age," although he had never been certain that the wording was accurate, and the Meridian sample had given the phrase a meaning he could no longer dismiss. He brought the relevant pages to the Institute and placed them beside the Meridian recordings, explaining that the manuscripts had been recovered during his 1998 expedition and that the records appeared to describe observations made during the final period of the civilization that had built the city beneath 3 moons. The researchers had initially treated the changing measurements as an unusual property of matter, recording when the phenomenon appeared and how long it lasted. But the later entries began to describe something more concerning as the disturbances became more frequent and appeared farther from the areas where they had first been observed. Materials that had remained stable for centuries were developing conflicting measurements of their age, and eventually, the same behavior was being recorded in locations that had shown no previous signs of the phenomenon. Mercer continued through the later pages until he reached a passage that had troubled him for years, because the researchers had begun noticing that changes in matter often appeared shortly before other disturbances around the city. Their early records suggested that the unstable environment was affecting the materials, yet later observations raised the possibility that the relationship ran in the opposite direction, with the changing state of matter appearing before some of the larger disturbances rather than following them. Mercer placed the Meridian data beside the manuscript and watched the 17-minute sequence continue across the 2 records. The correspondence was becoming difficult to ignore. Several pages later, he found another reference to the phenomenon, accompanied by a sequence of symbols he had never been able to translate, and the same symbols appeared repeatedly throughout the final sections of the manuscript, always beside measurements or observations that had remained meaningless despite years of study. Mercer had assumed that the information required to understand those passages had been lost with the city. Then, the Meridian sample changed again. The 3rd chronological state appeared on the monitor and remained visible for almost 12 seconds before the reading returned to its previous value. And when Mercer checked the timestamp against the previous cycle, the interval was again 17 minutes. He looked back at the manuscript. The researchers had been watching the same phenomenon become more frequent and spread beyond its original locations before their records ended. Mercer closed the manuscript and asked Meridian to continue monitoring the sample. Before the request could be completed, another message arrived from the laboratory. A second geological sample had begun showing the same pulse. It had been collected hundreds of miles away.
The second sample arrived at Meridian 2 days after the first anomaly had been recorded, having been collected and stored for several weeks before reaching the laboratory. Yet when its measurements began to change, the same 17-minute interval appeared in the data. Mercer was in the observation room when the second sequence completed, watching both samples move to the same progression despite having formed in completely different geological environments. And the significance of the comparison became difficult to ignore, because the phenomenon described in the manuscripts was now appearing in more than one location on Earth. That evening, Mercer returned to the later pages of the manuscripts and concentrated on the symbols that had resisted translation throughout his research, because they appeared repeatedly beside measurements and observations from the final period of the city, although he had never been able to determine whether they represented dates, locations, or something more specific.
Axiom had been comparing those symbols with the data recovered during case file 007, when it identified several structural similarities. And when Mercer opened the comparison, he found that portions of the sequences appearing in the manuscript also appeared within the information extracted from the rectangular object recovered beyond the threshold. The object was brought into the examination room inside a sealed evidence case, and Mercer stood over it for several minutes without touching the container, studying the dark rectangular surface that had given the Institute no indication of its purpose since its recovery. For 28 years, Mercer had assumed that the missing sections of the manuscripts had been lost with the city, and the comparison now gave him another possibility to consider. Because some of the information associated with the object appeared to correspond with passages he had never been able to translate. The match was incomplete, however, and the Institute could not yet determine whether the object contained the missing information itself, or whether both the manuscript and the object were records of something they had yet to understand. Mercer returned to a passage he had translated years earlier, where the researchers described objects whose measured ages had begun changing before similar disturbances appeared farther from the city. And as he read through the final surviving pages, he noticed that the explanations became increasingly sparse, while the measurements became more frequent. The last entries contained little interpretation at all, with the researchers recording intervals, locations, and changes in material before the surviving record ended, without explaining what happened next. Mercer looked from the manuscript to the two samples displayed on the laboratory monitors, where another transition was approaching. And for the first time, he considered that the briefcase he had discovered in the valley might have given him only part of the record, while the object recovered during the convergence experiment had preserved information that belonged somewhere alongside it. He still had no explanation for who had placed the briefcase in the valley, how the manuscripts had reached him, or why the rectangular object had remained beyond the threshold until the Institute reproduced the conditions that allowed it to be recovered. But the connection between the two discoveries was now strong enough that he could no longer treat them as separate events. The Institute sealed the object and transferred it to restricted storage, while Meridian continued monitoring the two samples. And before the next cycle could complete, another geological survey report reached the laboratory from a location on a different continent. The sample described in the report had begun producing the same 17-minute pulse. Mercer read the report twice before returning to the manuscript. 3 locations were now showing the phenomenon that the Three Moon City had recorded before their final days, and whatever had once been confined to the history of another world had begun appearing across Earth. The investigation was closed with one conclusion that could be stated with confidence. The phenomenon was spreading.
A photograph recovered with Adrian Mercer's restricted material from the April 1998 Valley expedition was transferred to Archive 0 several months after his return, where it was placed beneath an existing record carrying the designation, the first response. The original record had already existed before Mercer's expedition, although its author, source, and date remained unavailable in the surviving archive. The photograph was dated April 27, 1998, and showed Mercer standing beside the structure at the edge of the valley, with the distant outline of the city beneath 3 moons visible beyond him. Mercer was facing the camera, and the position of his equipment and clothing corresponded with the field records from that day, although none of the surviving expedition members recalled taking the photograph, and no camera belonging to the expedition could have produced the image from that position. Mercer himself never recorded having been photographed there. The reverse contained a handwritten message: "Don't let them reach here." Beneath the message was the beginning of a signature, although only a single letter remained legible: M. The rest had been damaged beyond recovery, leaving no reliable way to determine when the message had been written or who had added the signature. The photograph was subsequently placed among Mercer's recovered material and transferred into Archive 0, but the surviving records contain no explanation for how the photograph came into his possession.
The circumstances surrounding the photograph became more difficult to reconcile when it was compared with Mercer's field notes from the same day. His records placed the area around the structure as empty during his initial survey, while the black rectangular briefcase he later recovered from the valley did not appear in any of the photographs taken before his return to the site. When Mercer returned, the briefcase was already there. No other expedition member remembers seeing the briefcase or who placed it, and no surviving field record identifies another person entering the valley during the interval between the two observations. Mercer took the case with him, and the manuscripts recovered from inside became the subject of his private research for the following 28 years. Nothing in the transfer record explains why he chose Archive 0 for a material from his own expedition. The complete access to Archive 0 remains off-limit to the Institute's current members, with no explanation given on why. Only a few documents were later allowed to be declassified by the archive team. What remains is the photograph, the warning written on its reverse, and the briefcase that appeared in the same location after the image was taken. Mercer knew enough to leave the valley after the warning.
Someone else had already known that Mercer would be in the valley at that exact time and had left the warning there for him to find.